This episode is brought to you by the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference happening in Vancouver, BC, Canada, November 2nd to the 4th. Speakers include Elizabeth Bast, Dennis McKenna, and Paul Stamets. Check out the link in the description to this episode to learn more. See you there. Hello everyone, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Unlike the episodes you heard throughout the course of this summer 2018, this intro is actually being shot pretty much right around the time that this episode is releasing. I am home from my European tour and back in my office feeling very nourished to come home and sleep in my own bed, and also feeling very nourished by an excellent adventure across Europe this summer. I have intention to release some of the talks that I gave throughout the summer sometime during the winter months, so definitely keep up to date on my social media feed or sign up for my newsletter, which will be linked in the description to this episode, to know when those talks will be released for you to hear. Anyways, let's get into today's episode with Zoe Helene. A little heads up right from the beginning is that if you're watching this on YouTube, we don't have video for Zoe's feed, sadly, but we have video for my feed, so you can watch my talking face throughout the duration if you want, or just, turn your screen off and listen, might as well. Another thing to keep in mind is that we kind of jump right in the middle here. Zoe and I started having an excellent conversation, and it was dynamic and all over the place. Not all over the place, but a variety of topics. And then the interview starts just when it begins getting relevant to Zoe's work and to, psychedelic culture. But you're probably wondering who Zoe is, so let me read her bio. Zoe Helene is a classically trained artist and cultural activist working for women's self-liberation, healing, and empowerment through intentional journeying with natural psychedelics. Zoe is founder of the eco-feminist advocacy group Cosmic Sister. Cosmic Sister's trio of Psychedelic Feminism education grants, which is the Women of the Psychedelic Renaissance, Cosmic Sisters of Cannabis, and the merit-based immersive plant spirit grant, promote women's voices in the field of psychedelics and our fundamental right to journey with evolutionary allies from the nature such as ayahuasca, cannabis, peyote, and psilocybin mushrooms. She also advocates for the rights of indigenous people, especially women and children, and gives back to communities by promoting mutually beneficial cultural preservation, respectful exchange, and affiliate evolution. Zoe's work has been featured in articles and interviews in Forbes, BBC Travel, Outside Magazine, Bust Magazine, Vice, Broadly, LA Yoga, Boston Magazine, New York Magazine, Newsday, Utend Reader, Wisdom Daily, Alternet, Organic Authority, MIT Technology Review, Fast Company, and other top-tier media venues. So it's very exciting to have Zoe here on the show. Before the interview begins in just a moment here, there's a note that I want to make, which is that this episode gets very political. In fact, it's basically about politics for the vast majority of it. And politics that right off the bat, I think some people listening, or at least people who may not listen, the kind of politics that people have knee-jerk reactions to. They're the issues of our time that are the ones we all feel most sensitive about. They're the ones that are really quite relevant in a lot of ways. And I think it's important that we talk about politics as a psychedelic community because, aesthetic and music is not going to take us very far as a psychedelic culture, and medicine is great too, but we need to step out into the broader range of what it means to be human and what it means to be alive in the modern world. And politics is a pretty significant element of being human and being alive in a democratic society. So we go into some themes that have been prevailing over the show for the last few episodes, such as cultural appropriation, the patriarchy, the wounding of men, and we get into a hotbed topic, which is feminism. Of course, we talk about psychedelics as well. In particular, we have a pretty deep discussion about ayahuasca and ayahuasca tourism, as well as Zoe's organization Cosmic Sister and what it proposes to support insofar as women in the ayahuasca or psychedelic culture. So thanks for tuning in. A big thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed in the upper corner of this episode or in the description to this episode on jameswjesso.com. or on YouTube. If you, the listener, would like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/JamesWJesso, where you can become a patron. You could also leave one-time PayPal donations, the link to which is contained in the description to this episode. Thanks so much, and enjoy this interview with Zoe Helene on Adventures Through the Mind.
My career path, as it were, is odd, but to me it makes complete sense. So I don't really know where to start, but
well, it would make sense because it's your path, right? And you have all the intimate inner workings, or the intimate knowledge of all the inner workings of the causal chain that brought you from there to here. So
yes.
It seems to make sense. Well, why don't we take a step back then? This is a very wild. It's like we're coming up from a delta into the river here.
Yay!
But why don't we track back to the first thing that you and I actually talked about, which is basically feminism, because I'm going to call this podcast episode Psychedelic Feminism, because that's sort of the hashtag that is really deeply associated with your work and gets a lot of like very interesting discussion around. And as you might know, the people on YouTube, there's a lot of people on YouTube where this podcast gets released out who are very, we'll say, reserved about the value of so-called feminism, to put it very lightly, and almost to the point where it's inaccurate. And
they're trolls. So you want to say they're trolls?
It's possible, and I can also understand why some people have their reservations, and this really has to do with the control structure of the patriarchy and how essential it is for the sense of inner security for a lot of men and a lot of people who are challenged deeply in the very essence of who they are when they hear challenges against patriarchal values or the patriarchal system, especially if they identify with that system and thus their inner security is being threatened simply by telling them that they are the enemy or whatever. But
they're the enemy. Yeah, exactly. No, well, I think that really what this comes down to, and it's such a conversation right now amongst ourselves, I should say, the sort of feminists, the psychedelic feminists I know, for me, there are other groups forming, which is great. There should be more than just one. It should never be a monopoly. That's a bad thing. I don't want that, and I hope they don't either. But I don't have control over what they're doing and what they're saying, and neither would I ever want it, or because that's also a patriarchal concept. But I just want to say, I can only be responsible for my feminist views, and I do try to select people who share a lot of my views to be part of Cosmic Sister, but they really are quite broad. And by the way, this does include men, because men can be feminists too. You don't have to be female to be a feminist. Mm-hmm. So we do have some great guys in the midst. But it comes down to, I'm 54 next month. So I've been around a little over half a century, which is a bit scary, but it's the truth. So I have a little water under the bridge, as they say, and I have been a young feminist. I've been a 30-something, a 40-something, and now I'm a 50-something. So you do learn as you go along. You do gain wisdom. I'm all about progress and love. So it doesn't do any good. First of all, I've never been a male-hating kind of feminist, and I've never been a castrating kind of feminist. That just doesn't vibe with me. It just makes no sense. I love men. I've always loved men.
It also doesn't actually seem to accomplish any of the goals that are proposed to be set forth by people, like by the agenda of those people. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not at all where I come from. It's simply that, and also I have to say that anybody born today is not responsible for the patriarchy. We didn't invent it. We didn't put it in place. It's been around for thousands and thousands of years. So we're all part of it, just like you and I didn't personally have to do with slavery in this country. We can accept that it happened. We can accept that it still has repercussions for people in real life ways. Mm-hmm. Very, very much so. We can also acknowledge that this country, well, in the United States, I know you're Canadian, but mm-hmm. in the United States, this country was founded on genocide and slavery. That's a really intense statement, but it's the truth, and we need to see it and acknowledge it and learn. But I wasn't involved in that. My people were not involved with that. They came later. They were, in some ways refugees. They were, getting away from Holocausts and whatnot on different sides. I'm a mix. I'm a typical American mix coming from various countries. So, but the people in my family, for the most part, didn't have a choice. Some of them did, some of them didn't, but they came to the United States to make a new life because things had gotten so bad where they were. And I inherited like everybody else, I inherited the history, his story, right, of the United States, or this land mass we like to call the United States of America at the moment. Now, I like to say that too, because it wasn't always the United States, and it hasn't been the United States for very long. It's a land mass. It just, when you look at like an old globe, you see how things shift. And then if you look at a really old map, you think, whoa, that wasn't even vaguely what we call it today. So I like to say that because empires do fall, and we better watch out. We're playing with fire at the moment, literally.
Well, that's definitely a real thing to consider. There's a lot of suffering, and there's a lot of trauma in a lot of people. I would just dare say absolutely everybody, regardless of where you might currently stand insofar as the established power, the institutionalized power complex, or how you live that power complex. Internally, we are still victims of trauma. We are, all of us, eventually, if you track back far enough, we are displaced people without very much cultural heritage and raised in an incredibly unnatural environment, and in a very unnatural sort of mode or modus operandi for life here in the modern world. So all of us have something going on, and all of us at some point, some far way back enough, if not presently, are responsible or have been involved with some sort of aggression or displacement of others. So it's like we're all victims and perpetrators in our history as
we're humans,
right? And we're all grappling with that. And I like that you say we're not responsible. I like to think that we are responsible for who we are and how we show up to the world and how we show up to others, and that larger context considered, the trauma considered, but that it's not our fault. And it's not other people's fault. And it's easy to feel all that pain and to see all that suffering and to be like, I feel this, and I need somebody to blame for all of this. So we blame the system. I mean, fair play. Some of us straight up blame the patriarchy. Like the patriarchy is some exogenous, inherent structure. Well, it is a problem, but it's not.
But it is, like you said, it is a structure. It's not a human being, and it's not even a series of human beings. It's a structure that's been around so long that we can't even, to just like change it is such a big thing. So we're all part of the patriarchy. And women have lots of patriarchal wounds, and men have lots of patriarchal wounds. So when I say like we're not responsible for the past, okay, because we didn't do it. We didn't do the thing. But we are, like you say, we're responsible for who we are. And as individuals, we make up culture. So if we're awakened, enlightened, or at least seeking enlightenment types of human beings, which most of us are in the psychedelic scene, we're looking to be the best human beings we can be before we die.
Or at least we claim that.
Most of us are trying. And I think that, we look at the future and we take responsibility for what we can do to hopefully make it a bit better. And I think that's really what it falls down to. I can't be responsible for the past, but I can be responsible in my own, little person way for today, what I do today, what I say today, and taking a stand and being an advocate is definitely working towards a better world. But I'm just one little person and some others. So we do our best. That's all we can do. And yes, you're right. It's not okay to blame others. And also, this is what I often will do. I will switch it to racism because I think you and I would be considered white, okay, which I always put quotes around white because my people, most of my people were persecuted for not being white. So, and I grew up being considered ethnic, unquote, ethnic looking. I was an actress, so that was a real thing. And I was discriminated against constantly for looking ethnic. I also got a lot of roles for being ethnic when they needed somebody ethnic, but that was also really weird and racist feeling. Like, what? Why are you going to cast me in the Spanish role? I'm not Spanish. I don't have a drop of Spanish blood. Well, you could look Spanish. Well, what does that mean? It was all this ludicrous idea of physical characteristics defining the talent, which is a very old school idea in acting. But my point is that I dealt with it a lot. But I'm a little darker skinned than a lot of white people, but I can get pretty light in the winter, and then I get pretty darn terracotta in the summer. So there was a portion of my life as a child when I experienced racism, pretty severe racism in the South, when they thought I was Native. They would say Cherokee because it was North Carolina. And they would say all the horrible things I say to these poor little girls that are Native American in North Carolina. And they were pretty harsh. So I had that experience, even though I knew I wasn't Native. I was proud that they thought I was Native. I thought it was really sweet and cool, but I wasn't. So it was a weird experience for me because I didn't really belong to that tribe. And yet I was getting some of the racism towards me. It happened in New Zealand too. When we went to New Zealand, the Maori people, the kids decided that I looked half caste. That's what they call a mix of Pakeha and Maori. So they took me in. And once they took me in, they took my whole family in. And my sisters look more white than I do. So I've had some interesting racial experience. But what I want to say is this, even with the experience I've had, there is no way that I can know what it means to walk in a racist culture, which essentially this is, and know what it means every single day to be a person of color. I do not know what that is like. I have ideas. I have researched. I have a lot of friends who've told me about it. I've read some really, really good books. I've done some good homework. I've listened to some amazing talks. I've educated myself, but I still cannot know the pain of the day-to-day abuse that people of color in this country face in other countries where there's racism. But we're talking about the United States right now because that's what I know, and that you can't, if we take on the whole world, then we're dealing with all sorts of things. Because you go to Africa and most of the countries, it's mostly black. So there's no issues with black there. It's there, right?
Well, isn't there shadism that exists in those countries and even in the black communities inside of the United States?
It depends on where you are, and the shade thing has to do with mixing a lot of the time. Certainly in India, there's a really bad thing, but most of that, I believe, came from colonialism. These are English, British ideals that were pushed onto the people. And unfortunately, you see a lot of self-hatred, but it's taught and it's psychological, so it's really hard to pinpoint. And this kind of brings me back to feminism because I care about everybody, whatever you want to call yourself in the gender spectrum. And I do think that gender needs to be completely rethought. Okay? But females who were born and raised female in a male-dominated culture, we do have some things in common. And it's a group that I can focus on and do some research in and learn from and all of that. I can't take everybody. I can't take humans. It's too big of a group. Plus I am a female, raised female in a male-dominated culture. So I know this intimately. I know what it's like. I've had a lot of experience. And I've always been the type of woman who has a lot of female friends who tell me things. So I've heard many, 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 many stories about all sorts of things, eating disorders, rapes, traumas, you name it, sexism in the workplace, etc. Just all my life, I've been privy to those kinds of very intimate discussions. So I know a lot about it. Whereas I don't I mean, I have a lot of gay friends, but I don't know what it's like to be gay because I'm heterosexual. And that's my authentic self. So I'm not ashamed of it. It's just who I am. So I like to say that that is my group, but that does not mean I don't care about everyone else. And we're all in it together. And the more I do this work, the more I realize that. My latest work in the Amazon with ayahuasca was actually about patriarchal wounds and males, specifically in my life, including past lovers who were very important to me, and also abusive males. One particular professor in graduate school. But I had to go through this. It's a long vision story, but I had to go through this whole part of the sort of vision sequence, where I was in my 20s, which is when sort of this happened. And I went back into each major boyfriend, and there was some transition era there. I was a serial monogamous, so I had some long-term, really deep relationships, but it spanned during that 10 years about, I'd say, 3 major guys, and then on the end of it, another. So those men came to me in this vision one at a time, and I was the same age, and they were the same age we were when we were together, which was in some ways sweet, but it was all this very focused, almost like, I don't know how much you know ayahuasca, but sometimes she, quote unquote, will scan you. And that was almost like what it was for me. It's as if she went into my psyche, pulled up all the archives, and all of the ones that had to do with patriarchal wounds with men in my life. And it was intense because I got to visit that man, but in our old bodies. But I remembered specific things that they were in pain over and that really affected our relationship. Really difficult fathers, for example, mostly really difficult fathers. But also, being oppressed by the patriarchal ideals that were shoved down male little boys' throats, like ideas of the famous one being, don't cry, be a man, those kinds of things. Those kinds of things are
anger and lust are the only appropriate emotions to feel in any great measure.
Oh, that's awful. I'm so sorry to hear that. I've never heard that before. See, I learned something too. And see, for us, for women, many of us have, not everybody, but many of us have deep self-esteem issues. I do not have that, thank goodness. But a lot of women do, and it's really, really hard for them. And it's so sad to see when you see these amazing women, and deep inside they've got this low self-esteem. That makes me cry. And
so
then
let's pause for a second. I know I might be interrupting your long vision ayahuasca experience, because it seems that we're shifting, and I want to maybe feel as though something was made clear about psychedelic feminism being defined as not maybe the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people. I know many men and women who, whenever they hear feminism, their immediate sense is like, oh, another hateful person who's just looking to blame men for their wounding, who might very legitimately have reason to be angry at men, but aren't actually looking to have positive change, or what you're talking about, your compassion, are just looking for an opportunity to rage and blame. And this is not what you're talking about. You're talking about a very inclusive, compassion-based manner of saying, we all are in this together, and we're all hurt, and we're all wounded, and we all need to work towards bettering the lives that we're in. And I identify with this specific group, and my work is with this specific group, which happens to be women. And that specific work is based in psychedelic work. And so psychedelic feminism is taking the principles of healing specifically to a targeted group with an understanding of the whole, but specifically for women, working with psychedelics to heal wounds that are relevant to women in the modern era.
It's very well said. I would also say that it's not all about healing, although, you could potentially try to put it all under that umbrella with psychedelics. I think there's also a great deal of empowerment, inspiration, and I like to say self-liberation. But again, if you wanted to as a guy, you could claim that too,
for sure.
And you could actually take any subgroup and do what I'm doing with it. And I encourage people to do that all the time, because people will come at me and they'll say, well, what about, the transgender community? I'm like, you know what? Do that. That would be amazing. And I would support you, but I don't know anything about that. I mean, other than the people I know and what I listen to on the radio, and I'm trying to understand it. I can't understand it intimately enough to really be of help in any real way. I can be of help in this particular way because I get it. If it didn't happen to me, it probably happened to a sister, literal sister, like a biological sister, or a best friend, or my mother, or my aunt. Like I got lucky and did not get raped in my life. However, I almost was raped quite a few times, and it was really close. So I don't, I know enough about some of the feelings of it, but I didn't have the experience, and I'm grateful for that. But a great deal of women have had that experience. So I feel like what we're saying, you said it really well. But if you could just open it to self-liberation as well, which, yes, you could push under the subject of, the main title of healing if you wanted, but I think it warrants its own path, because self-liberation is learning how to liberate yourself. It doesn't require someone else to do it. It's like this learning of, okay, I see that in me. I can work on that and get beyond it. And this gets down to the programming part. We're talking about patriarchal abuse, right? Which is cultural abuse. It's a type of cultural abuse, just like racism is, and ageism. And they all have a lot of things in common, and they're often overlap. And there's economics in there, so there's classism too. So all those isms have a lot of interconnectivity. I just want to just say this. We talked about how this country is, based on genocide and slavery, while women were just shy of slaves back then.
Yeah. Well, even marriage, I think institutionally, like the whole idea of husbandry was around the idea that a woman was actually a child bearer for the man, a piece of livestock, and she wasn't a whole person. She was a half a person. She was her father's daughter until she was her husband's wife, and that's where the whole practice of a woman taking the man's name came from, as far as I understand.
And they also had no legal rights. So if somebody had inherited something from their family, a woman, and had a business, the moment she married, she no longer owned that business. The business would go to her husband, and she couldn't sign documents. And there's all kinds of things like this. And there were also, spousal rape was legal up until quite recently. If you look it up on Wiki, you'll be kind of shocked and horrified with how long it took to get rid of that. Like, it was okay to rape your wife because she was your wife, so you had access to her at any time, which was just terrible. So it's surprising, it's actually shocking how slow some of these things are to progress. And so yes, we walk through this world with particular wounds that you can begin to see commonalities and patterns within the individuals, and there's a lot of pain. And this is the thing that I like to say. We're not, right now we have a patriarchy. First of all, I don't believe in a matriarchy. I want to be clear with anybody listening. I don't think that would be any better. It might just be as bad. If thousands of years the women had been in charge, the women would also be, perverted in some way. I really think that's probably true.
Yeah, it's not like men are fundamentally damaging humans, and the problem was just that they had too much control. It's like humans damage humans, and too much control, period. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when guys are really, trying to be good guys and say, oh, I wish it was a matriarchy, I'm very quick to say, oh God, that would be terrible. Because there's some not very nice women in this world too, and this gets to something, that's happening right now. I'm feeling it. We have been trained, just like other people, other types, groups have been trained with this horrifying divide and conquer programming. And that is why we never get our 50% of the power to influence positive change. It's not power for the sake of power. It's power for the sake of being part of the conversation and really, having a fair say in how this country and this world is run, right? How things go down. We don't have anything near 50%. So why don't we just take that, since we're about 50% all around the world? Why can't we just take it? Well, part of the reason is because we are conditioned to tear each other apart, compete with each other, not be friends, backstab, all of that That is part of what was instilled in us. And who knows when or how. I'm not saying necessarily that they're these evil guys at the top that sat around and saying, how can we keep these people from ever bonding enough to, grow too powerful and take our position or whatever. I'm not saying that happened, but it's possible. It certainly happened in colonialism. That's what they did in India. When they went to India, my understanding is the Raj era was moving into a different phase, and they had recently abolished the caste system. When the Brits came in, they thought, oh no, this is perfect. Let's just reinstate it. This will help us take over this massive country of brilliant people. Brilliant, strong, creative people, right? So what they did was they reinstated the caste system, and the Indians sort of tore each other apart, and the Brits came in and took over. So it is actually in the rule book. If you look it up, the divide and conquer is part of the training that they had when they went to these countries to take them over. And it's not just, the big colonial powers. It's not just, Britain, Spain, France, and Portugal, and whoever else. It's also these others in the East that did, like there were all kinds of terrible things that happened in other countries we don't like to talk about because it wasn't the same sort of system.
Right, but and even ancient indigenous tribes weren't exactly constant egalitarians and good communion with their neighbors or anything.
No.
It's like we are in many ways, it's like we are a predatory and also sort of like kin-oriented species that has fought tooth and nail to keep its place and has done that on greater and greater scales over the course of our evolution.
And I think, unfortunately, some of the most brutal have been the ones to survive and breed. And not just I don't know how much of it's in the DNA, probably some, but I think a lot of it is in the behaviors and the cultural things that we pass on. And that's what I think psychedelics is about. For me, most of it is about these really, really taking this opportunity to look at our social programming in our families and our small communities that we belong to, as well as the bigger communities and then the world, as a species. Because if we don't do this, if we don't break free of some of these incredibly destructive and self-destructive patterns that we have, we're going to destroy ourselves and everything else. And I happen to love humans, so I don't want us to be that. And that's
I think
me.
we've got great potential. We could, what is it that Bill Hicks said? Like we could, explore the stars together. We could, yeah.
Yeah, we have extraordinary creativity. We can love. We have language. We can make things. Look at the arts. Music. That's wonderful. Well, it's wonderful what we have the capability of doing when we are rising to our higher selves. But we are conditioned, and the conditioning is very difficult to pinpoint sometimes. And I've never in my life seen anything like psychedelics to get to the heart of that and to expose it to ourselves in a way that is something we can accept and look at and do something about. So it's not so harsh you just run screaming for the hills. You actually are able to have empathy for yourself and say, okay, I see what I've been doing, or I see where that comes from. That's wrong. I need to change that.
Well, I'm gonna jump in here a little bit because maybe there's a point of clarification you'd like to make after I say this, which is that it sounds like you're giving a really benevolent feel to psychedelics. Like, oh, the psychedelics, they show you what you need to work on in this really good and positive way, and they definitely can. But I personally have a little bit of a hard time accepting that, like, by nature, that's what they do and that's what they offer. It's far too often that we see, like, for example, one of the things that the Cosmic Sister sort of helps promote or educate around is that there's rampant misogyny and sexual abuse inside of ayahuasca shamanism cultures, and they're taking heaps of ayahuasca. So it's not like these drugs inherently make you a better person, but that there's a context that's required in order to generate this type of positive healing and liberation.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And that is true of all of the different things like yoga. It happens in yoga too. And you'll have somebody who claims to be a Zen master and then sort of, is serial affairs with somebody and just brutally hurts his wife or whatever. I know somebody like that. And, you just got to wonder, where's the disconnect? But it does seem to be a disconnect of some sort. And I think that it's not a magic potion or a magic pill. I think it's what we do with it, what we bring to the table. And that's a lot of what I do with the women I bring to the Amazon is we work together ahead of time more and more now as this program has kind of evolved. I like to work with women, and I do work with men also, by the way, and I really enjoy it. But I'm just trying to focus on something at the moment because I'm on to something. It's very exciting. So the women, we work with each other for sometimes as long as a year, back and forth emails, writing assignments, phone calls, and really start to think about what is it you want to work on when you're in Peru. And that doesn't mean that's the only time they're ever going to have this experience, but in many cases it's the first time. And if not the first time, it's often the first time in as close as we have to a traditional setting with indigenous people in the Amazon. So to me, that's really special. And it's worth all of the work I have to do and the money I have to invest to get them in there to have that experience. Then if they turn around and they want to have some other experience somewhere else in some Brooklyn apartment or Hawaii or whatever, wherever else it's going on, then they've had that beginning in the place where, ayahuasca came from with indigenous people. They've had that connection. They understand that that's, if you love ayahuasca, and if you're really truly grateful for what ayahuasca has done for your life, then give back to where it came from, the people who work with it there and the rainforest itself. And that's, a heart of why I bring people there. There's an ethnobotanical aspect that's really important to me. And I think that the cultural appropriation versus cultural preservation conversation is very important. And, there's also feminism there.
Let's jump into that.
Yeah.
Because that's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I have some experience with ayahuasca. I've been to Peru. I've done, ample research, enough so to feel I've done enough research to know that my opinions are informed, but I have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. So like that good little window there. And one of the things that I wonder about is yes, I mean, very much so. We're in this situation where the culture that we're in here in North America is pretty fucked up and has really left a lot of us damaged. And it doesn't seem to offer any real sense of like entrenched meaning in our lives that has any real sense of longevity at all beyond however long it takes to realize that acquisitions no longer feed your life, or however long it takes to realize you're dying now and none of it actually mattered. So in this situation, we become culturally disenfranchised. And of course, we want to reach to the Taoists, the Buddhists, to yoga, to shamanism, to this and that, to ayahuasca, because it makes sense. We're looking for somewhere, somehow, that has some sort of authentic culture left. And when we talk about cultural appropriation, obviously the immediate sense is like, for me, it's like, white festival goers wearing Native American war bonnets. That's like the epitome image, right? with no understanding of like how, like
who are not knowing that they're doing that. They're not thinking about it.
Right.
Because I have some really beautiful vintage jewelry that, supported some communities, and I'm stewarding it. And I always say which tribe it's from and how extraordinary it is, and what a shame that, so many of these arts were lost. So I actually wear the jewelry with pride. But yes, if I didn't, then it would be appropriation.
For sure. And that's a very important nuance that I appreciate and regularly appreciate in the discussion. I'm not one of those like hard and fast SJWs that's like, it kind of looks like appropriation. Call the fire brigade. Like everybody brings people down on Twitter. But the question here is like, so that's the immediate sense. And this is something from, again, I've been questioning this deeply in myself thanks to being exposed to it by another person named Stephen Jenkinson, which is like, how different am I from the rubber tappers when I go down to Peru and try to get authentic culture, authentic spiritual something from somebody who happens to seem as though they have what I have a sense of being impoverished by a lack of?
Well, this is a very complicated subject. And first of all, most of what I've learned about this, at least in the ayahuasca scene and the sort of plant medicine scene, is through my work with my husband, who is a high-profile ethnobotanist. I don't know if you know his work, and I think you should, maybe do a podcast with him and really go into that with him, because he has decades of experience with this, and that's his passion. But that said, he's my husband and my sweetheart, and I bring a lot to the table professionally too, but I've also have to say, from an ethnobotany perspective, he's a mentor. I've learned most of my ethnobotany from Chris. I mean, I've definitely learned it from some others, got some really great info from Dennis. Dennis is awesome early on. And it was also really important for me to hear other people at that level and their ideas and sort of compare and contrast with my husband's and find where I sit. Because some people could call me an ethnobotanist to a point, but I know that there's a big difference in my work and their work. So I wouldn't call myself an ethnobotanist, but I know it really well. And my husband's work is field work primarily. He is all about bridging the world. And the intent of what he does is to find plants that have market value on the very far end of the spectrum. If you want to call it the consumer, he hates that word, but often it's actually literally to consume. So I call it that. The end user, we use, that was a term in high tech. In natural products, it was consumer. Whatever you want to do, it's the person buying the product on the other end. So if you can create an economic model that actually does bridge the worlds as directly as you can to the people on the other end who really have been, in many cases, impoverished and disenfranchised. And that's a sad state of affairs, but it is in many and most cases true. These are not idealist, we have these ideas of like sweet little native kids running around, and in some cases that's true, but there has been so many brutal things happening to these people to put them down that it's not as simple as that. And, many of these people, they want modern dentistry, they want cell phones, they want internet, they want their kids to go to college. You can't just assume that they want to run around in grass skirts. That is not the case. So it's a complex issue. And if you do it right, the idea is you go to a culture, they have their plants that are indigenous to their region. And therefore, because they're indigenous to their region and because people love plants and people have co-evolved, that means if you pick the plants that are important in their region, then create trade in a way that they are able to work with their plants that they're proud of, that are part of their culture. It becomes cultural preservation as opposed to appropriation. And there is an economic trade involved because somehow there needs to be money from the outside world coming into their world so that they can rise out of poverty, because poverty is not pretty. Now, I will say this. I get the word privilege a lot, and I like to say that privilege is a subjective thing in some ways. I mean, look, if you're a kid in India picking trash out of a sewer to make a living, that is clearly underprivileged, right? But when I first started traveling with Chris, it was early on, I think maybe the second or third year of our marriage, we were traveling with NBC Nightly News, and we went to this village that had just been denuded. I mean, all the big trees were gone. There was like one tree who was awful because it was so hot. And because of this, there'd been oil, there was oil slick in the water, so there must have been oil rigs there that had been long left behind. The fish was almost all fished out. So they were fishing. They would go out all day to find us fish, and they bring back these little teeny fish. So they were eating horrible processed food from South American brands, just crap. Right? That was their food. And instead of drinking water, they gave the children that horrible, it's pea-colored soda. It's like Coca-Cola in South America, Inca Cola.
I've seen it.
And in huge bottles. So the kids are just drinking sugar. And they don't have dentistry. So and this is the really awful thing too, the little children, they had no school, they had no education. Their parents were trying to just make it through the day, and the women were, washing clothing and dishes and everything else in a filthy river. And because so much of the jungle was gone, there was tall grass, and in the tall grass, the things that survive and thrive are things like rats and poisonous snakes and mosquitoes. Oh God, the mosquitoes there were beyond compare. Like nothing worked on these mosquitoes. So it was not pretty. It was not ideal. But here's the thing that was interesting. I took a lot of photos because I was stuck there for about 10 days, and the guys liked to go off and do the guy thing. So I was left in this village without speaking anybody's language because they spoke Shipibo. And I thought, these children are curious about me, and I love children. I'll try to teach them something, without language. And we had a blast together. And by the end, we were, they were crawling all over me and following me around. And I taught them some basic math in the sand with, sticks and stones, and they picked it up. And here's what I learned. These kids were really well taken care of with what the parents had. They loved their children. They loved their children. The children were happy. They had a secure family structure in that even if the fathers had buggered off, because sadly they had in most cases, there were very few males. The males that stayed on were like heroes. Just to be a male in the village. Most of the males impregnated a woman and just kind of like disappeared. But the women were kind of like pulling it together as best they could. The children were happy. And I remember a friend of mine looking at the photos and saying, oh, why don't you adopt one of those poor children? And I said, they're not poor. They have their parents and their family and their siblings, and they have love. They're poor in ways that I can help, but they're not poor like take them away from their family. And I always remember that statement. She's a wonderful person. She's a giver. She loves to help, abandoned animals and kids and all of that. But that was her first impulse, was to think these kids need adoption. No. They don't need adoption. They need support. So when you talk about cultural appropriation, you have to think about cultural preservation also, because if they're struggling to survive, to feed their kids in the reality of what it has become in most cases, in many cases, all over the world, even in remote areas, then they can't keep their culture because they're struggling to survive and they're drinking Inca Cola. And a couple of generations, guess what? It's gone. That culture is gone. So when you flip it, if, again, you're doing it from a respectful, intelligent, educated place where you're going to drink ayahuasca and you are coming in gratitude to these people for sharing their culture, and you're going to give, not to take, you can help them not only make a decent living, but also not even just preserve their culture, but evolve their culture to actually be able to really give time to it and to teach their kids. And their kids are becoming interested in shamanism. So it's not all bad. It's just like human beings. There's bad ones and good ones. So you'll find a kid who's learning shamanism because his mother learned from the great-grandmother and had enough to learn from somebody else and teach it to the gringos coming down. And I don't like that word. But, it's not all appropriation. It depends on how it's done.
Yeah, that's great. It's a really excellent way to address that concern. Thank you.
Well, people don't know. How can they know? How I wouldn't have known. I would have been just like these people. I would have been like, cultural appropriation is bad. And guess what? It is bad. Cultural appropriation is bad. Definitely. But, because of what happened in my life and who I ended up marrying and the things that I have seen in my own eyes, it's not pretty out there. To get to the really beautiful wilderness spaces that still exist to the point where you can collect wild harvest medicinal plants that are of value, or cultivate them sustainably in an area so that you can help to keep the people who live there from taking their trees, et cetera. This is a big economic equation, and we can actually help by buying products that are really, truly done right. We can help. We're not taking from them. In fact, the people with all these beautiful hearts that care about cultural appropriation often without really understanding, are hurting the very people they think they're trying to help. you can really help. If you took it all away, the economy would collapse, and the ayahuasca shamanism would all but die. And that would be a terrible tragedy because it's extraordinary. And I primarily work with the Shipibo people because I really like what they do. I've worked with other tribes and I really like what they do too. But again, I like to focus and really understand something to a point. And I've really become, friends with many people from the Shipibo tribe as much as we can be friends. We're sincerely friends. We see each other and hug when we see each other. I know their kids. They know me. We're kind of like, we've been adopted. I have a name. They gave me a name. Chris got a name last time. That was exciting. But they are thriving, and in the good situations, they're thriving. And even in 10 years, I have seen this happen. Now, that said, and I do think you should interview Chris because he's really could talk to the plants, right? He is currently in a boat way far away downriver in the Amazon to see for himself, because this is his area of expertise, is ayahuasca truly being the vine, ayahuasca, the plant, being over-harvested in the wild because of the popularity? What's really happening to protect the actual plant itself? Because that is truly a tragedy when plants and sacred plants, or any plant, any medicinal plant, become so popular, they too can be threatened, just like their wildlife. Let's just say when you go to World Wildlife Fund, most of the people look at the charismatic species that are like warm and fuzzy or cool, like a tiger or an elephant or a dolphin, right? Those are the so-called charismatic endangered species. And it's not an accident that these big organizations promote those animals, because those are the animals that get our attention and get donations. But there are all these other species that don't get the attention, and they're in trouble too. So they collect the money from the charismatic species and try to help all the others. And guess what? It's the same thing with plants. Plants are a form of wildlife. So when something becomes really popular, you have poaching issues and you have the same kinds of things. So he's out there doing what I know he does, because I've been on these expeditions with him. I'm not on this one because frankly it's really, really hot and you're in a boat with a bunch of guys that are sweaty and eat meat, and I'm a vegetarian, and I just had other things to do, and I've been on those, but I know he's having an exciting time. And it turned out it was a very dangerous area because there's cocaine being grown. So, he's finding all kinds of things, and he'll have some very interesting, fresh, real frontline information for our community. And I love him for that. And it upsets me when I hear people raging about cultural appropriation, even though, yes, there is cultural appropriation and that's not okay. I think that there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of sensationalism and, frankly, cocktail chatter. And that upsets me because I know actual people in so many countries that will be hurt by that idea because they need the money. Vanuatu, for instance, the kava trade. I have been to those islands, those super remote islands that you have to take like literally a plane and then another plane and then a smaller plane and then another smaller plane and then a boat and then a smaller boat and then you walk. And a truck. I forgot the truck. It takes a long time to get to these islands where they're really native. But they're also impoverished because they too had colonialism. So they're not themselves, not in the pure sense, whatever that was. They were, by the way, cannibals. There are still people alive on Vanuatu who ate meat, human meat. So, this is stuff I've seen only 10 years of marrying Chris. He's done this for decades, and it's all about plants. But to him, the people matter more than the plants.
So let's round the corner here a little bit, because the we'll say over-harvesting of plants is an issue, and cultural appreciation, cultural appropriation, all of these things are considered. And also another thing to be considered is, of course, the as positive as it is for communities and cultures that have been severely impacted by the globalized capitalism.
Yes.
And how positive it can be to find a consumeristic like a market and a trade that can help them preserve their culture as
Yes.
as a necessary, definitely not the most optimal, but a necessary adaptation to the situation that globalized capitalism has put them in. There's also the problems of widespread sort of tourism and like the worst side of capitalism when it comes to ayahuasca culture in particular. And given the amount of time we have left, I know this is a big topic, but if you can talk a little bit about some of the problems that are present in the ayahuasca culture in Peru and maybe even globally that are pertinent to your mission with Cosmic Sister, with maybe kind of introducing it as like specifically, this is what Cosmic Sister is, and this is what we provide, and this is why.
That's a lot of things to talk about, but I want to kind of put this out there before I forget that I do have pet peeves. You hear things on social media and whatnot. You see these things, these ideas bubbling up from people who mostly are well-intentioned, and they're not in the field often. Sometimes they are, but they don't do what we do, and they can't possibly know the things we know because they're not out there in that way. So tourism, the idea that the phrase ayahuasca tourism really drives me crazy. It is not okay to go down there and drink as a tourist. It is not something, it's a sacred medicine. And also, if you go down there with the intent of just like trying it out, like seeing Machu Picchu, and I went to Machu Picchu and I bought a little tchotchke and I took a picture with a, llama and a little girl and I drank ayahuasca. That's awful. That's the worst of it. And I think ayahuasca will likely kick your ass. And you know what? I shouldn't say you deserve it, but I think that people need to take a little bit more respect and think about their journeying. And if the tourism is appropriation, I'll spit it out. The tourism, in my opinion, is appropriation. If somebody goes down, however, and drinks and gets a really amazing experience and bonds with the medicine and then becomes a, rainforest advocate or something, is that appropriation? No. Sometimes the medicine actually does just work on somebody
who
had no idea what they were getting into.
That appropriation, whether or not it's appropriation or appreciation, is whether or not the outcome aligns with particular ideological values about preservation of the rainforest?
I think that's part of it. I think that if you go down there with the, thinking ayahuasca is one thing and you drink it and you get like an amazing experience and it opens your mind to the realities of the situation and you start on a new path to be a better person and you give back, that's not so much cultural appropriation. It's not a negative. It's a good thing. The medicine worked on you.
But
even though
wouldn't the intention have been cultural appropriation, but like the happenstance luck of the draw just turned into something that could have a positive impact?
Yes, I think so, because the medicine itself has power. It is a psychedelic, and it is a specific psychedelic. So, I think that does happen. I get people write me and say that they were, traveling in Peru and they went to Machu Picchu and tried ayahuasca and were kind of blown away and it did wonders for their lives and now they want to come again and really do it right. I wish that they'd done it right the first time. I don't understand why anybody would do it without educating themselves and preparing. It's a big thing. And if you do prepare, it can be so magnificent. So why would you? But that's me. I was one of these kids who I grew up very sex positive. It was the 60s and 70s. Sex was very, open and whatnot. But I was the girl who wanted to wait till I was in love to have sex the first time. So I'm a bit of a romantic. And I do bring that up as an analogy sometimes or a comparison because like for me, ayahuasca or any sacred plant, I want to do it right the first time. I want to really have the experience, the beautiful, amazing experience of that. It's precious, and you can only have a first time once.
That's true.
So I tell people that, but I think what were some of the things that tourism that I wanted to bring that up. So with Cosmic Sister, first of all, I do help guys too. I get a lot of men who want to go down and ask questions and I work with them as best I can. I don't turn a good person down. If I can help somebody understand ayahuasca and work with what their intentions are going to be or in integration, I'm there as much as I can be. Things are growing with my work, though, so it's getting harder to find the time. But I mostly work with women, and it's the focus on psychedelic feminism, if you will, or feminist issues. There are certain things that are just plain human that a woman may have. For instance, grief. Mm-hmm. Depending on what the grief's about, of course. You could have grief for things that are feminist issues, but a lot of things are just plain human. So those things matter to the woman too for her healing and her work. But then there's this other set of, and it's large, of things that seem to be specific to women in our culture. That doesn't mean every single female has this set of things, but they are highly likely to have a large piece of that set. Like if you were to put it out on a table, and say, okay, this woman has about 5 of these 10 things, and this woman has about 3, and I know what I have, I know what mine are, Yeah,
like there are certain commonalities of experience that can be held among specific demographics of people.
Yes, yeah. And these are what I work on. And it's really fascinating. And what I'm finding is the more preparation work we do, and it's also really important who you pick, because the person needs to be keen. I like to work with people who are nice to each other. That may seem really obvious, but it's not always the case. So really kind-hearted women who want to be part of a whole as well as do their individual journey. So really be there for others, even if they need their privacy, still be kind to each other. Mm-hmm. I think humility is really important. I think humor is really important. I think intelligence, open-mindedness is really important. Those kinds of things. I do like women who are really talented in some way. So I like heart. There's a Joni Mitchell song, Women of Heart and Mind. It's not a song, it's a lyric. And I like to say that I tend to gravitate towards women of heart and mind. But yeah, so we're in there and we're working on our own stuff. And if you focus on it, if your intention is, for instance, several of the younger women especially went into the Maloka last time with the intent of finding their voice or freeing their voice. And they got it. Mm. And I'll tell you, for me, the payback is watching them live their life with that voice and listening to that voice. And I'm crying now. I mean, all I can say is I'm humbled, and I'm glad I can be of some service in some way, and it's working. The other thing I find a lot of eating disorders, body dysmorphia, that's a really brutal one. And then there are all these awful sexual sexual violence. Let's just put it under that. And I count sexual violence the way that Canadians do. And I don't know if you know, but in Canada, this is what I was recently told by a Canadian I'm sponsoring in Spirit Plant Medicine, that rape and sexual assault in Canada is treated differently than in the United States. They accept that it doesn't necessarily have to be penetration to be rape. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really evolved, because you can get almost all the typical trauma associated with rape that is penetration if you get everything but penetration. And to have somebody say that doesn't count is also damaging, so you also get that damage. So a lot of things around rape, and in one case a rape murder, lots of rapes, I'm sad to say, including ones that the women didn't tell me. They didn't share that with me. Suicides of parents, that's something males also suffer very terribly from. Chris is a suicide survivor. His father committed suicide. So whenever somebody comes with my group that has a suicide they're dealing with, I always bring Chris to the table for that, because you know what, he's the expert there. I'm there as a woman, but I'm very happy to say I don't really truly know that personally. I know that because I'm really close with my husband, and I know how much it has affected him in his life. And his ayahuasca work a lot of it has been around that, which, by the way, that was his father, and that's a patriarchal wound. And his father had a patriarchal wound. And this is all out public, so I'm not saying something about my husband he wouldn't want in public. If you watch the ayahuasca monologue, it's out there. He does a beautiful job with that. But, I always say to people, we wouldn't be married, we wouldn't have gotten married, and we wouldn't have stayed married if it weren't for ayahuasca. And I think that's really true.
So,
I don't know how it is for you. I mean, you're really a mushroom guy, right?
well, yeah, that's a kind of a complicated question, but I definitely much more so than ayahuasca. Yes.
You know what Dennis McKenna said to me once? He said, "You owe it to yourself to explore mushrooms." I have not done a lot with mushrooms. 3 times I can count them. That's how little. And I was very careful. But what I got was wonderful. It was always the same, basically a reuniting with nature in a really profound, beautiful way, where I was part of nature and that was perfect, just the way it was. I was a little teeny human, and not very important, and yet important in the diversity and, the greater ecosystem. And it was super sweet. And I was really could feel the sun on my shoulders and my feet on the grass, and it was blissful.
That's nice. That's a nice experience to have. For me, I find what puts mushrooms at the priority level for me over ayahuasca is that I look at where I'm at in my life and feel that a lot of the challenges I have gone through as a result, sort of like we've been talking about here, so we'll say like transgenerational trauma that echoes back as far back as the. I don't want to participate in the fallacy here of the noble savage or anything, but could really be tracked back as far as when the original people of my ancestors were displaced from their homelands.
Right.
And which even then, I mean, there's just displacement all the way back. But to me, I feel like one of the biggest challenges that faces me is not so much the traumas of my personal history as it is the trauma of having no sense of real culture that I can bank on existing with meaning beyond my own personal life, beyond my own sort of like personal needs, which the consumer capitalist culture of Canada really seems to be focused on, and I'm just entirely disenfranchised from that culture, and I'm happy about that. But in that, there's, like I had said before, there's this desire for something meaningful. There's this desire to kind of like find yourself at home in something beyond yourself. And I see reaching to yoga, to Tai Chi, to all these different things, ayahuasca, Shipibo culture, all these things as an extension to some degree of looking for that. And I can see that some people find value, and there are people who like live that life despite the fact that they are quote unquote white people from New Jersey, that they get to a point where they live that life. They are
Yes.
properly disciplined practitioners of that culture.
Yeah.
But anything less than that, I think to some degree is an appropriation. And I don't mean that from the town crier sort of like appropriation, but I just mean in the sense that it's not fully going to offer that deep sense of longevity.
Agree.
That
I agree.
Yeah. And for me,
I would actually agree with that, because you know what, if you don't put the work in, then you're just playing and you're in fantasy land.
Right, exactly. And so why I'm interested in mushrooms is less about the mushrooms themselves, although the experience and the mushrooms themselves do really interest me. But it's about what role a practice or like a culture that includes a sacred or a revering practice with such a powerful and beautiful medicine can have if we build it. Because it doesn't really exist for us here, and it could. Because I think at this point,
yes,
Psilocybe cubensis is a pretty like transcultural. Even this like the psilocybe mushroom in general, like these are transnational. They're everywhere. They are beyond nation. They are endemic to all sorts of different places in the world, including where I live. And so I'm interested in exploring that because I'm interested in participating in the building of a culture that could be sustained for generations to come that I didn't take from someone else.
Now, see, this is where it gets really interesting, because the way I look at it is when somebody, raises the flag and starts saying cultural appropriation, unless it really is cultural appropriation, which is true in some cases, it's to me about cultural preservation, exchange, or evolution. And it may sound really obvious, but most people don't think about it on a day-to-day basis. All cultures and all traditions were created by somebody or somebodies. A human. created them. So we can hold them up and say, oh, but that's tradition. Sometimes you can also be enslaved by tradition.
Yeah,
and not
I
all
agree.
tradition is good. A lot of tradition should just be, abolished. I like to say, genital mutilation, child brides, cannibalism, slavery. These are traditions. Those are the worst of the worst, some of them. And, there's also all kinds of other things that are just plain sexist. Girls are only allowed here and guys are allowed here. That stuff should just be done with. Let's just leave it in the dust and move on. So in terms of developing your own culture and your own ceremonial use or whatever it is around mushrooms, it's funny because I feel like with the psychedelic renaissance, and not everybody who's listening to this podcast will know what we're talking about, but I sense a lot of people will. There is a renaissance happening, and it seems like we're at the cusp of where we're beginning to say exactly what you're saying is, okay, I've really enjoyed working with these different cultures, and I will always have a part of me that's there. My heart will always be with the Shipibo people, for example, or whoever else. But I'm becoming interested in cannabis as a journeying plant. It's a master plant for me, and that's a Shipibo term, which I like. For you, they would say that the mushroom is your master plant, which in fact is a fungi. But I love that idea. Yeah, I always have to say the sacred plants and fungi because the mushrooms are really important. Also, I haven't explored them. I always remember Dennis saying that to me because, I owe myself that exploration, and I'm looking forward to it, by the way. But I'm also not a psychonaut like a lot of people are. A lot of people can do a lot of psychedelics and be okay with it. For me, I need integration. I'm a lightweight and I go really deep. I do my work and I love it. But I want to really do my integration work when I come home too. And I want to work in the world, the world. I mean, they're all part of the world. I get that. But I want to do some work out here, in the media world. And, I got trolled on that. Oh my gosh. Recently, Michael Pollan, he shared something that I was part of, and it was a Vice article that was on psychedelic feminism. And most people don't know this, but the journalist had actually reached out to me and wanted to do something just of me, but her editor asked her to do a bigger picture. So I was like, well, then here's some really great women to check out. And she wrote an article on all of them, or a bunch of them anyway. There was quite a few in there.
I just read that article. It's from Vice, you said, right? I just read that article today. Yeah.
And I was thrilled to be with, some of those great women. So, yay, right? But they used my photo at the top, which was, I'm in my 50s. So looking at a picture is hard enough. But seeing it on the big screen when I opened it up on my big computer, I have a big monitor. I was like, whoa, that's large, And so when he shared it on his feed, my photo was there and he tagged me and Bia. So he didn't tag everybody, though. He just picked 2 people and tagged them. And the thing is, I'm getting all this interesting stuff from the feminists, the undercover psychedelic feminist groups are like anti-Pollan. And it's like, you know what? I appreciate that he put that up there because that was, again, this is a guy who, he's a guy and he grew up in a patriarchy. And so he's going to have some patriarchal programming. But what I see is a guy that gave. He's using his position, which is huge right now, to actually support others, not just psychedelic feminism, but he's sharing a lot. If you look at his feeds, this man is out there saying, check out what's going on in psychedelics. And I'm like, my hat is off to this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, he's not perfect. Okay, let's tear him down. I mean, that's something that you mentioned earlier that I have a problem with when you say that you get flack from people for not including, say, LGBTQ in your psychedelic feminism work, and you're like, well, I support it, but I think it's a grave mistake to call people who are doing good work down because they're not doing it for everybody. They're only doing it for certain groups. I had
that problem with privilege too, and somebody actually came up after I had spent my time and money to do something I thought was really sweet. The women wanted to be at Psychedelic Science on the symposium stage, so I funded that. And I'm not wealthy. I mean, I'm wealthy in the ways that matter to me, but I left all that behind in the high tech. I chased money for a while and had it for a while, and it was all stolen from me. So, that aside, I don't chase money anymore. I have what I really want. And I'm really grateful for that. So I do feel that I'm privileged. I have my health. I have family that loves me. I have a husband that loves me, and I adore him. And our relationship gets better. I have a really privileged life. I do work I love. All of that's privilege, right? But I don't have a lot of money, and I give way more than I should because I care and I want to, and I love this work. So I spent my money to have 4 awesome women who had just been to the Amazon with me on plant spirit grants. There was a 5th who is wonderful, Sandra Garcia, who lives in Asheville, and she had just signed up for yoga teachers training, so she couldn't make it. So, those were the 5 women, and to me, they were diverse. I didn't see them as 4 white women. I saw them as, a Greek American and a woman with a PhD in psychedelics, who's really, dealing with language of psychedelics, and who is an academic, and another one who's from Wisconsin, living in LA, who's a journalist following, drug culture, she calls it, and music. I don't like the word drug, but she uses the word drug. Awesome, sweetheart, totally different people. And Selma is an MD who has an integrated medical degree from Harvard. Totally different women, okay? Mm-hmm. So, but, from one, if you wanted to look at the panel and say white, I suppose you could, but to me that's insulting their heritage, which was different in every single woman's case. Mm-hmm. So the one woman who would have counted because she's from Colombia, to me, that also feels a little racist, but she couldn't be there. So she wasn't there. So somebody in the community comes up to the one woman who was emceeing for us, who I hadn't met, but, I thought would do a really good job. I wasn't there. I wasn't able to make it, which is one of the reasons I did this, supported this panel, because they all wanted to do it. Mm-hmm. So this woman comes up to her, and the first thing she says is, am I supporting underprivileged people? As it was like basically a critique saying that, oh, these are nice privileged women up there. Well, first of all, privilege, like I said, is very relative. Remember those kids in that Shipibo village? They were privileged because they had parents that loved them and who they loved. That's privilege too, right? They did not have money and they were not able to go to a school, but they were being taught other things. They were being taught how to forage in the forest and how to play soccer and whatever their parents were teaching them, how to make amazing textiles, etc. Right? They had love and security. So then you look at some of the people who I know, who I have awarded grants to. I know them intimately. They share their real pains, their deep wounds, and those things to me, I know some of them. I know that they're not privileged in those ways. And I also know that people are struggling with like intense student loans. And you know what? It's not my business to share who has what. And it really upset me. I really got triggered by it, and I had to really look at that trigger and what that was about. And I think it was because, I have a different idea of what privilege is, and I think I thought it was a very negative way to look at a very positive thing that was new and fresh that nobody else had done before. And the answer is, hell yes. My money goes to underprivileged people, including people who don't have money, if that means that's underprivileged. So for the record, hell yeah. And it's my money that I give. And yeah, sometimes I give loans, but I never ask for it back because I know they can't pay it back. And that's okay. It's okay. I get it. I didn't grow up with money.
So I think that's an interesting point too, because I believe that us as people, especially those of us who are underprivileged or marginalized to different degrees in different sections of society, are increasingly learning it's possible to use our voices to call things out, to call things as we see it. And and there's a piece of that include people who may or may not have more the implicit biases of priority lean in their favor, and they want to use that to the benefit of those that they see where those implicit biases are not in their favor. And that in that sense, there are elements of call-out culture that are really positive and will be in time probably very constructive contribution to the larger we'll say, Western culture. Currently, it's often embodied in a very narrow-minded and infantile way, as it's still kind of growing into how to, like, into the complexities of these topics. These are incredibly complex topics that cannot just be, represented as a tagline and then shouted out in 240 characters.
And you know what they say about assumption, right? It makes an ass out of you and me. I mean, to assume, to look at a group of women and say white privilege, that's like, it insults the individuality of those women, the complexity of them and their family and their tribe. It really annoyed me. But just to say, for me, I do care about diversity, and I don't like racism, and I don't like classism either. So yes, I try to work with psychedelic feminism and also reach out to women who represent different groups, because that's my way of doing more work that I would love to be able to do if I had a clone. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, you're doing your absolute best with the contextual resources that you have, and you're doing seemingly a pretty damn good job.
Well, I'm doing my best. That's all I can do. I think it's growing. I mean, I think if we had more money, obviously more donations, we could do a lot more. We're totally on a roll. Oh, and I just want to say, the Plant Spirit Grant is I may have said this to you, but it's charismatic. So anytime I put out a press release or any type of language, almost everybody picks up on the Plant Spirit Grant. Oh, these women are going to get to go down to ayahuasca, all expenses paid, yada, yada, yada. That's cool and everything, and it is a really exciting, wonderful project. However, there are two other projects which are identical, except that one is psychedelics and the other is cannabis. So there's a lot of crossover. I just break them up because cannabis is such a huge subject right now, and it's very important to me. So it's basically educational grants, meaning not like to send somebody to school or to help with training, but to help somebody educate the public on the benefits and risks of psychedelics and cannabis. So I do tend to be interested in the natural psychedelics, but I'm loving this part of Cosmic Sister, and I've been doing this for a long time now, and I'm seeing it make a difference, and I'm loving that. It's all about placing speakers, women speakers, or if they're already placed, helping them along financially so they can get there. Because, look, I'm married to one of the big guys in the space, so I know most of the big guys in the space, and they're all in their 60s and they're all white, whatever that means. And beyond that, they're also awesome guys. They're awesome. I mean, at Spirit Plant Medicine, they've got Paul Stamets and Wade Davis and Chris and Dennis McKenna all at once in one place. That's, you got to be there, So I'm not going to say that the big poobah males are not awesome, because they are, and they're super accomplished and they've made great contributions. However, there are also women out there who need fostering in order to get name and face recognition, and that is a currency in our culture. So that's what these grants are about, and I'm about to put out a press release that announces a bunch of those, and I'm super excited about it. So, I want to put that out to anybody listening. If you've got you've been invited to go to a psychedelic conference and speak, or a cannabis conference and speak, and you've really got something to share, reach out.
Cool. Well, let's end it there. Let's maybe offer your social media handles and the websites that people can look to get more information about these grants and learn more about the umbrella of Cosmic Sister and all that you're doing with that organization.
Sure. I try to keep it really easy. It's all Cosmic Sister. So at Cosmic Sister, hashtag Cosmic Sister, CosmicSister.com. If you want to reach me, you can send it to either media@Cosmic Sister, or you can just send it to Zoe at Cosmic Sister if you like, or send it through the contact form, which is CosmicSister.com/contact. I mean, I try to make it really easy. I do like the hashtag Psychedelic Feminism because it's feisty and awesome, and it is exactly what I'm doing right now. So, and I did coin the phrase for what it's worth.
Cool.
So that doesn't mean I own it, of course, but I do like a little credit once in a while.
Excellent. So Zoe, thank you very much for being on the show and going so deep on some way more political topics than the show typically addresses. But absolutely, I think essential at this time and place to have these big. Well, this podcast, I say like, oh, we talk about the taboo subject of psychedelics because we don't speak openly. We just maintain ignorance, and same can be said about political values as well. So, thank you.
Yes, and it's all connected because as a species, as we evolve, we need to evolve our political and cultural. Things that aren't serving us, just like our own personal individual things we work on with psychedelics, we need to do the same for our culture. It's no different.
Completely agree. Okay, so for the listeners, hold on.
Sorry, I was just going to say thank you. And I could speak to you all day. I want to hear more about your mushrooms, so I will be listening to some of that.
Well, thank you. I'm happy we had a great conversation. And for the listeners, if you would like to get all the links that Zoe just mentioned, you can head to jameswjesso.com and find the show notes for this episode. Zoe, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
And cut. Okay, that concludes today's episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Thank you for tuning in. If you like what you heard, please go give Zoe's work a deeper investigation. Follow her on social media. She's got a pretty good feed. And just generally stay up to date on what she's doing. You could also stay up to date on what I'm doing by heading to Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter and follow me at James W. Jesso. If you really like the show, giving it a shout out on social media of some variety, telling a friend, these are great ways to support. Another great way to support is financially via Patreon by heading to patreon.com/James W. Jesso or by leaving a one-time PayPal donation, links to which are contained in the description to this episode. You could also buy some merch. The link to that is also contained in this episode. This is the first podcast recording intro, outro thing I've done in months since I've been traveling, so sort of, dusting the rust off a little bit. So hopefully it went all right, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode. I will see you on the next one. The next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Thanks, and take care.